Hello, everyone. Welcome to Pediatric Grand Rounds. I'm going to turn it over to our Vice Chair for Education, Dr. Sandrain Van Schaik, to introduce our speakers for today. Sandrain.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Pediatric Grand Rounds. I am really excited to introduce our panel and moderators today. I don't know that all of our panelists are quite on board yet, so we're still waiting for a few people, but I'm going to introduce everyone. I know people coming from clinic, but I'll introduce everyone and then hand it over to the facilitators who will take it from there. So we put this panel together in conjunction with the BCH Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Committee, because we realized several weeks ago that the elections would probably be tumultuous and have a lot of discussion about what the results would mean for child health and our role as pediatricians and pediatric providers. Our two moderators are Anda Quo and Felicity Stanley. Anda Quo is professor in the Department of Pediatrics and the co-director of the Cross Bay UCSF Center for Child and Community Health and co-director of the California ACES Learning and Quality Improvement Collaborative. She is very passionate about leveraging the expertise we have at UCSF in partnership with multi-sector stakeholders to make child health and wellness a reality for all children. Many of you probably know that Dr. Quo was the founder of the UCSF Pediatric Leadership Advancing Health Equity residency program, which has been recognized by awards and grants, and she's really very passionate about the issue of health equity and increasingly becoming a national leader in this area. Felicity Stanley is a medical social worker in the Hematology Oncology Department at UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital, Oakland. She is a Bay Area native who completed her master's degree in social welfare at UC Berkeley. She's a member of the BCH DEI Council and a co-leader of the Education Task Force Subcommittee and one of the master brains behind doing these joint grand rounds. She's also a member of the Swart Center Rounds Committee at the Oakland campus and a member of the BCH Black Caucus of Oakland. And she's very passionate about the greater community, working with the greater community. She's a member of the Soroptimist International Oakland Club that focuses on improving the lives of girls and women through education and economic empowerment. So the two of them have agreed to moderate this panel. And the panel has a number of people that I will briefly introduce. Amy Alden is UCSF Director of Local and State Government Relations. She serves as UCSF's primary liaison to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, the Mayor's Office, the State Legislature, the Governor's Office, and various local and state agencies, and will be helpful in helping us discuss how we can be effective in advocacy. Dr. Raul Gutierrez is a clinical instructor at UCSF, clinically working at Zuckerberg San Francisco General. He's the co-founder and co-director of the Bridges Clinic, which is a clinic that focuses on the care of immigrated children. And he's also the co-chair of the American Academy of the Pediatrics Council on Immigrant Child and Family Health. Jyoti Marbin is an associate clinical professor in the Department of Pediatrics and the director of the Pediatric Leadership for the Underserved Residency Program, as well as the Director of Intern Selection and an Associate Program Director of the Pediatric Residency Program focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion. Dr. Zareen Noor is a pediatrician at UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital, Oakland, the primary care clinic. She's the director of the international clinic within the primary care clinic, which focuses on the medical care of immigrant and refugee pediatric patients. And she has a U.S. civil surgeon designation to provide medical exams for immigration purposes. And then Dr. Javed Ross is a pediatrician also at UCSF Benioff Children's Hospital, Oakland. She works at the BCHO FQHC in both primary care and adolescent health, and she's also the medical director of the Alameda County Juvenile Justice Center. And then Daniel Rulerich, you heard from him not too long ago during Pediatric Backgrounds. He's a third-year resident in the PLUS program in the Department of Pediatrics. And he's done a lot of work in advocacy, particularly around affirmative action. But he is currently joining also because he was very involved with the Voice project that our residents were involved in. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Anda and Felicie.
Thank you. Felicie, jump in at any time. So we are really excited to facilitate this incredible panel. Just to give a little lay of the land, we have two main questions and we're going to pose them to specific members of the panel. And they'll have up to 5 minutes to inform us and educate us. And if you're getting close to that 5-minute mark, we will put a little heart in the chat so you can get a little warning there to try and wrap it up. Because our goal will be to save about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A at the end. So for everyone participating, please post your questions in the Q&A rather than the chat. And with that, I think we'll launch. Phil, say anything else?
No, I think we're just excited to have everyone with us to be able to have this wonderful discussion, and just again thanking our panelists for taking the time to be able to be with us to talk about these really important topics.
Thank you. So if each panelist can, for this next question, can provide a brief background of the issue, election outcome, and a reflection of the results and impact. The question is, the election this year had a significant focus on the national presidential election, yet there are important state and local outcomes from the election that may have gotten buried in all the other attention. So what are important state local results that impact child health and health equity that you would like to share? And I'll start with Zareen, especially wearing your hat with the focus on immigrant health.
Thank you, Anda, and thank you, Sandrine. So I'm going to talk a little bit about immigration. I know it's been a hot topic on our national stage, just given our current administration and the policies that have been enacted the last 4 years. There's been over 400 new immigration policies that were introduced, everything from restrictions at the border, refugee resettlement, how we do our asylum system, the DACA program, immigration courts, as well as visa processes. And then with COVID-19 pandemic hitting us early this year, the administration really pushed forward some other of their immigration policies, including bans on travel and pauses on visa issuance for certain groups. And then pretty much closing off the US-Mexican border, ending asylum there. So these have been a concern for our immigrant families, but not just immigration law. I think, given this pandemic, this has been affecting our immigrant population disproportionately, just due to a range of vulnerabilities such as overcrowding housing conditions, high concentration in jobs where physical distancing is difficult, being a frontline worker. Immigrants are at much higher risk for COVID-19 infection than our native born, and we've been seeing that in both our San Francisco and Alameda counties. And then, many of our immigrant families access vital support that would help ensure their safety, health, and financial stability, such as things like the Federal CARES Act. There is no relief for undocumented workers or their immediate family, even those who are U.S. citizens. So this affects many of our U.S. citizen children. There's, I think, an estimate of like about 15 million people who were excluded from the stimulus relief package. And some of the states and cities have stepped up. California did that with our Immigrant Resilient Fund, Oakland CARES Act. Some of these other cities and groups came to help some of our immigrant population. So these are kind of just the backdrop of what immigrants are facing. And in California, we have one of the largest, we have the most immigrant eligible voters. We have about 5.5 million. more than any other states. And that's because California is home to more immigrants than any other state. We have about 11 million immigrants, and that's about a quarter of the foreign-born population nationwide. And here in the Bay Area, 36% of our San Francisco residents and 33% of Alameda County residents are immigrants. And for our children, over half of our children in the Bay Area live with at least one immigrant parent. So that's a big population we're dealing with. So, some of these ballots and measures that we've seen in the state and city election are indirectly affecting our directly and indirectly affecting our immigrant population. So if we look at like Proposition 15, where that would have assessed taxes on commercial properties, that would have it would increase billions of dollars for our underfunded schools and local government systems, and that failed on a state level. But on a local level, Measure Y in Oakland, which was an Oakland Unified School District school bond for $735 million, that passed. So that's good, because what we know is that all our children are suffering during this pandemic, during distance learning, but our immigrant students are having a harder time. They're facing much more challenges to learning in this new environment, and we know that they have lower access to at-home resources or support that, and it increases their educational divide. And also a lot of our children, we're finding that a lot of our children who live in undocumented or mixed status family households have a greater concern about online privacy and security when learning in virtual setting. And so sometimes we're seeing a lot of decreased participation. So OUC has been doing, our Oakland Unified School District has been doing a great job about kind of increasing support for immigrant, the English learner students, but they need more funding to kind of provide more support. And I think statewide, this would have been great for a lot of the school districts that are having a hard time providing support to students who are really falling behind. Some other ones that are, I think, affect some of our, there's Proposition 18 that did not pass. This would have allowed 17-year-olds who will be 18 during the next general election to vote on primaries and special elections. But Proposition G in San Francisco and Measure QQ in Oakland passed, and Measure Prop G in San Francisco allowed U.S. citizens who are at least 16 years old and registered to vote for local candidates and local ballot measures, which is great. And then Measure QQ in Oakland allows persons aged 16 and 17 to vote for the office of school director. And I think there's some similar measures like this in other counties as well. And I think that that's important, because I think, given that half of our children have at least one immigrant, parent, some of these, they can push some of these agendas with through the city and local measures. And then real quick, the Prop 22, the app-based, this is the one with the Uber and Lyft, where they would be considered independent contractors. So that, just to cite, a lot of 78% of the app-based ride-hail and delivery workers are Black, Latino, Hispanic, Asians, and multiracial. And most of those are immigrants. And so that initiative really denies these workers protections that they need most, especially during this pandemic. And that, indirectly affects or directly affects the children who of those drivers. So those are just a few things. I think there's a lot more, but those are just a few things that I wanted to highlight.
Thank you so much, Dr. Noor. I realize there is no heart emoji that we can put, so if you see me hold this up, that means there's 30 seconds. And I am now going to pose the same question to Dr. Woolridge here next to me, and with the focus particularly on affirmative action in Prop 16.
Thank you so much, Anda. So For those of you who know, Prop 16 did not pass this time around, and that would have repealed a ban on affirmative action that was instated about almost a quarter century ago in 1996 by advocates such as Ward Connerly and also the then Governor Pete Wilson, who put a lot of backing behind it. This is important to note, and we definitely are really scratching our heads a lot as to why the prop didn't pass, because as we've seen nationally, a lot of people have been feeling more increasingly that we should be including more diversity in our workplaces. But then a lot of polling at the same time has been showing that it's just unclear about how it is that we want to go about doing that, because when the topic of affirmative action tends to come up, and that's where the divisiveness tends to be laid down. And that very much has been reflected in California with many individuals, particularly as was mentioned by Zareen earlier, we have a very large foreign-born population here in California. But in terms of eligible voters, at least for this election, still 55% of those eligible voters were white. And so a large question comes into mind in terms of, okay, was this not landing in that community? And also two, where was this issue also not landing in other minority communities? Which brings up the issue of also just education on the specific issue. And we know that affirmative action is an issue that just is very difficult to understand for many in terms of who it helps and in terms of what it really prioritizes. Notably, it was found in a poll that looked at Latino voters in the state of California, known as Latino decisions. About 39% of those who are Latinx in the state of California and were eligible to vote actually understood that Prop 16 would reinstate affirmative action. So that leaves a vast majority of our Latinx community who didn't quite understand what the proposition would have done. Additionally, we're looking at other communities currently to see, and this is happening all at the level of independent universities, because as we know, the UC Board of Regents was very strongly pro getting affirmative action reinstated. And so they're all individually looking at, all the UCs are individually looking at just which populations were voted against, which voted for, and which really may have not understood what the proposition was actually entailing. Which also speaks to another issue of voter outreach. I mean, we in the Bay Area have a lot of progressive voter guides that tend to come into our mailboxes, and same with LA County. And those are the two areas that largely voted pro Prop 16, whereas the other areas voted strongly against, which also begs the question of how are we engaging other parts of our community within the state that is very large and very vast. Additionally, we're also looking at other communities. For example, within the Asian community, a good amount of particularly our Chinese residents did vote against Prop 16, and a lot of work is actually being done in this realm to figure out how different populations in our state actually get their news and information on things. And there is some really particularly interesting work that's independently coming up from a lot of pro-affirmative action Chinese organizations that are looking at, for example, an app that I don't know if anyone here is familiar with called Wechat, but it's an app that a lot of individuals within the Chinese community do use. And it actually, a lot of very interestingly conservative, very like factually questionable things usually get put on that, that platform that then informs those individuals, you know, on how to vote for things. So I think this provides many of us a lot of opportunities to really engage two things, I think, and that is one, education on history, particularly given the history of affirmative action. It's a lot of it is unclear to still many of us, and also two, education on civics as well. Something that we also largely, many of us don't come to quite understand in any specific point in our primary, secondary education, but it comes like much later in our lives. And so I'll just stop there in terms of all the things we're thinking about, but really it's just understanding where the education needs to start so that we can start beginning on, okay, do we need to perhaps change the narrative around affirmative action and try a different name, similar to how we once, moved from gay marriage to marriage equality, and how a lot of things really got pushed forward when we started using that more as a term, or from gun control to common sense gun laws. Another example is looking at how we frame talking about healthcare versus talking about health. And so there are also those questions that we're also currently scratching our heads over in terms of, should we still use the term affirmative action, since when it is used, it's divisive? And should we try perhaps another narrative? Unsure.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rulerich. We're next going to turn to Dr. Gutierrez, who, otherwise known as Raul. We know you could talk about a variety of areas, but I'm going to ask you to wear your hat and leadership and engagement with the AAP and the CMA.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And yes, I am here wearing that hat. Thank you, Nadine, for sharing all the information on immigrant policy. So I think overall, we've seen across California at the state level in general, as well as locally, some particular domains in which healthcare can be affected. One is the criminal justice system. The other is civic engagement. The other is social determinants of health, particularly housing, and also overall access to care, expansion of access to care. And so I'll talk a little bit about that as it relates to the federal election as well. So under the criminal justice system, we saw California Proposition 17, which aimed to restore votes of those who are in parole for the conviction of a felony and to allow them to vote. We also saw the California Proposition 25, so the approval of replacing the cash bail system for more of a system more based on public safety risk. And then in several municipalities, we saw several initiatives, ballots, measures to think about the oversight and the reduction of resources going into police enforcement. And there was some variation kind of across the state around that. And the reason that I think this is important is because we have very much seen discussion and narrative kind of thinking about violence by the hands of police enforcement as a public health issue, particularly taking into account the amount of death as well as trauma that's inflicted on Black communities in particular, but also other people of color. And so the California Medical Association, as well as the American Academy of Pediatrics of California, took a stand in supporting these propositions and ballots that would theoretically move towards more civic engagement of people in prison, less people in prison, and less enforcement, and potentially, hopefully, less violence in terms of police enforcement. Unfortunately, the state did not voted no on approval of replacing cash bail. That was California Proposition 25, but voted yes on restoring the ability to vote for those who have been convicted of a felony and who are on parole. At the local level, we see, depending on where you are, different measures did pass and other measures did pass. So for example, here in San Francisco, we decided to vote on more oversight of the Sheriff's Department, as well as eliminating the eliminating the minimum amount of police officers who are active at any moment in time. However, there are other counties and municipalities who kind of voted against those types of measures. But I think it's just an interesting and I think change in the way we're thinking about health and having a position for those types of measures. Around civic engagement, Dr. Noor already mentioned some measures around the age limit for voting. And again, that had some mixed outcomes at the state and at the local level. Here at the state level, California Proposition 18, allowing the age of 17 in primary votes was a no. And at the local level, it was a mix. So some municipalities allowed for adolescents, young adults at age all the way down to 16, some were 17, to participate in local voting. So in Berkeley, that passed very well. Here in San Francisco, it was very close. In other municipalities, it didn't pass. So it kind of just a mixed bag around there. There are several local ballots, tax ballots across the state and as well as locally, that would provide monies towards combating social determinants of health. So here in San Francisco, Proposition A was passed, and that's $487.5 million bond measure with money going to homelessness, mental health, parks and infrastructure projects. And of course, improving some of those conditions, I think are very important. There are about 9,800 people who are homeless, with 52% unsheltered, 9% are people in families, and 17% are transitional age youth, which is quite high compared to other cities. So we do have some work to do on that front here in San Francisco. And then I would just say kind of in general, that California was really hoping, and I think happy to have a Democratic presidential president-elect, Joe Biden. You might see some more legislation moving forward for the expansion of access to care, in particular a new single-payer healthcare bill in California, expanding the Affordable Care Act, a wealth tax that could generate up to $7.5 billion a year to help finance potential coverage expansions, and expanding its Medicaid to more immigrant community, undocumented immigrant communities. This year, the state expanded coverage to age 26, and I think the hope is to have universal health care for undocumented immigrants in California.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive overview. And last but not least for this question is Amy Alden. Thank you so much for joining from the Government Relations Office. We really appreciate all the expertise your office brings.
Great, thank you, Anda, and to the rest of the panel. I'm picking up some good tips, so I appreciate being able to join all of you. I want to say that besides being the Government Relations Director for UCSF, I'm also a patient family. I have 2 young boys that delight in flinging themselves off of high places, and so I've been a patient in the Pediatric Orthopedics Department. Dr. Selena DeBorja has treated my boys for broken clavicles and other things. So I really appreciate all the work that folks in this department do. I want to say that my role is really to not just be the voice of the university in the Capitol and in Board of Supervisors, but to really elevate all of your voices. I'm always looking for opportunities to bring faculty, residents, staff to City Hall, to the state capitol, et cetera, because legislators really want to hear directly from you. Always happy to find opportunities to do that. Those few people have asked about my background because it's election season. This is Game of Thrones, for those of you who are not fans. Seemed appropriate for election season. So let me add a few things that haven't already been said. Yay, I see some appreciation for fellow Thronies. Let me add a little bit of context for the state election. As everybody knows, it was an interesting year on the state ballot. There were no statewide offices up. Governor, lieutenant governor, all of those were done in 2018. But all of San Francisco's state legislators were on the ballot, and they were all reelected. State Senator Scott Wiener, Assembly members Phil Ting and David Chu, all reelected as expected. Statewide, while there's a couple races that are still outstanding in the state legislature because they were very close, we do know that Democrats are going to keep a super majority in both the Senate and the Assembly. Very different than the national scene, which is much more split. The California state government is highly Democratic. And so with Democrats having a super majority in both houses, what that means is that they can pass a budget without any Republican votes. Democrats, and particularly our budget chair, Phil Ting, who represents San Francisco and used to be my boss, he's the budget chair. He is very interested in expanding the social safety net wherever we can, including expanding access to healthcare for folks who are undocumented. Folks here may know that when it comes to what the California budget pays for, the single biggest item in the state budget is K through 12, 40% of the state budget. So when we talk about what's the budget going to pay for, it's our kids that are in public schools. The second biggest item, which is about 30% depending on how you count, is Health and Human Services. So that's Medicaid. That's Medicaid approval for ACEs and for the diagnostic tools that we use at Benioff Children's Hospital, Oakland, to diagnose kids experience adverse healthcare events with the PEARLS diagnostic tool, things like that. That's what the state budget funds, and by having Democratic supermajorities in both houses, it makes it easier to provide funding for those things. But that said, COVID has blown a huge hole in the state budget. Everyone's taking cuts. University of California is facing about a $300 million cut because there is no federal stimulus package that we were relying on to fund the university. UCSF will see a very small impact from that because we don't have undergraduates, and we are funded more by the medical center and federal grants, but something to keep in mind. A lot has been said about some of the state ballot measures, so I don't want to repeat, but I want to add a couple things. Prop 14 was the stem cell bond, which the UC Regents endorsed. This passed. This will provide $5.5 billion with a B in research grants for stem cell research. And the agency was funded by voters back in 2004. Since then, UCSF has pulled down about $200 million worth of research from that bond. And it's for research on things like COVID-19, type 1 diabetes, sickle cell disease, Parkinson's, leukemia, brain cancer, and others. And so to the degree that there is research to be done on pediatric diseases using stem cell research, there's a whole new pot of money that UCSF is very well positioned to compete for. Prop 16 has been mentioned, the affirmative action ballot proposition. The UC Regents did endorse it. We're disappointed that it didn't pass, although UC can't take, UC has a formal position. We can't advocate, and I can talk more about that later. We're disappointed it didn't pass, but I will say that it passed in San Francisco. San Francisco voters overwhelmingly voted for Prop 16. And the last one I want to mention is Prop 15. This was the split roll property tax that would preserve people's property tax situation for residential properties where your home doesn't get reassessed until you sell it, but it would remove that for commercial properties. And so the idea is that that would create additional revenue for the general fund. And what is the general fund? What are the two big items? K through 12 and Health and Human Services. So we're sad that that did not pass. We think that the legislature may take another bite of the apple on that. But here in San Francisco, we support taxes. We support investments in our community, and we passed it here. Let me say a few things about the local election. In terms of candidates, we have 2 new members of the Board of Supervisors. Both of them are women. Connie Chan is a new representative of District 1 in the Richmond. She's known as more progressive. One of her big priorities is building more affordable housing. And it's very complicated in San Francisco, but to the extent that we believe that housing is health, and one of the main things that children need is a secure place to live. It's very expensive in San Francisco. Supervisor Chan has said she would make that a priority. Also in District 7 over on the west side, Myrna Melgar is the former director or chair of the Planning Commission. She has won the District 7 seat, also very interested in getting more housing built and actually has expertise to get that done. So we think that's going to be good. Supervisor Melgar is an ally of the mayor. The mayor appointed her to the Planning Commission. And we think that's going to bring a little bit more balance to the board, which had a super majority of progressive members before that. One of the previous speakers mentioned Prop A. This is the bond that will fund a variety of services. It's like a $480 million bond. Half of that money, a little over $200 million, is going to help with homeless services and facilities. So to the extent that that money will serve homeless families, that's going to be good for children. And UCSF plays such a direct role there, particularly at San Francisco General, and through services like citywide case management, where we provide outpatient mental health treatment as well as housing for folks that have behavioral health issues. And we think that, hopefully UCSF programs may be able to access some of those funds through our contract with Department of Public Health. And then lastly, I think a previous speaker mentioned Prop G, but I just wanted to clarify, Prop G did barely pass. That's the one that will allow 16-year-olds to vote in local elections, not state elections, not federal elections, but for anything local, 16-year-olds will be able to vote in the future. So those are the major issues, that state and local ones, that I think are probably most relevant to the pediatric practice. And I think when I come back, we'll talk a little bit more about how our faculty and students can engage further on future public policy issues and elections. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Ross, so glad you're able to join us. And I know you've been taking care of patients, so thank you for making time. Probably hectic, take a deep breath.
No worries, I'm sorry I'm late.
No, totally understand. The question is, the election this year had a significant focus on the national presidential election, and yet there are a lot of important state and local outcomes from the election that may have gotten buried. And what are important state local results that impact child health and health equity? And we're glad to have you, especially wearing your hat, focused on juvenile justice, and perhaps a brief background of key issues, the election outcomes that impacted the population, and any reflections of results and impact. And
Sure.
You'll see us waving. I'll be waving this when you have like 30 seconds, because we're trying to keep it to 5 minutes or so we have time for Q&A.
Oh, sure, no problem. I'll be
Thanks
very
so much.
conscious of time. So, yes, I am the medical director at Alameda County Juvenile Justice Center, which is probably one of the joys, one of the biggest joys. I have a lot of bright spots in the many hats that I wear, but I feel like that has been a true humbling and great experience for me. I just started that role officially, even though I've been working there on and off since 2015, in March. So can you imagine what life was like starting at a correctional facility in March? I was like literally losing my mind. But to stick to the topic of this discussion in regards to certain propositions that I feel like have had an impact on the work that I do and the patients that I see there, there wasn't anything specific, I would say, that was catered directly to juvenile justice, but I definitely think there were propositions that in the grand scheme of systemic racism and health equity, I think impacts my patients almost directly. So I would say the first one is California Prop 20, which was the stricter parole sentencing proposition, and it actually passed, shockingly. I was actually so disappointed in California in the grand scheme of our propositions, but that was one that I was like, okay, y'all get it a little bit. So that passed, and I think that that kind of shows that we're starting to see how stricter sentencing is not necessarily the answer to certain crimes, especially taking things from the perspective of a victim. I think there's a lot of evidence, particularly in the juvenile justice system, about the importance of restorative justice and taking alternative approaches to criminal justice. And so I think that from my perspective, over 75% of the patients who I see are Black or Brown and are repeat offenders. And there's been not a lot of support until recently, actually, to try and change that, to break that cycle. And so I think this is one proposition that actually goes to show that, making what is now considered a misdemeanor a felony is not the answer. And so putting our funds into trying to find the answer, which is really around restorative justice, I think is a great first step. And then I think one that I was super disappointed in was the fact that Prop 16, which y'all probably already talked about a little bit, did not pass. And I think, again, since the vast majority of my patients there are Black and Brown, for them to not be able to gain access, to break the walls of systemic racism, which I think is what affirmative action really does, to not be able to get an extra step ahead, considering how many steps we are behind, is disappointing, particularly in California, because it's like, if California don't get it, when is the rest of the country going to get it? So I remain hopeful that, these are just first steps in these conversations, and that we can start to build more knowledge about these issues, and next time around we'll have more success. So I don't know if that kind of addresses the question. I could talk more. If you can't tell, I can go on and on, but I'll stop there.
So appreciate your perspective and expertise in this area. Thank you so much. And I'm going to turn it over to my co-facilitator, who will pose the next question to the panel. Thank you, Felicity.
Thank you, Anda. So yeah, for our next question, who we're going to pose it starting with Jyothi, is what lessons can we learn from this past election? And also, what are next steps for us, a pediatric and child health community and academic health institution? Like, what are the next steps that we can be taking?
Excellent. Thanks, Felicity. Great to see everyone on the panel and to be with you all today. I think I'm going to take this question as what are lessons from the election and just expand it to thinking about over the past year as well. And I'm answering this with my diversity, equity, inclusion, and medical education hat on, just for context. So obviously so many lessons from the past election. I'm going to focus on just 2 lessons learned for me. And there's sort of the bad one and the good one. The unfortunate reality I think that we saw is that white supremacy is still alive and well in our country, and I'll talk more about that. And then the second lesson I think is more positive, which is big change is possible. So in terms of white supremacy being alive and well in our country, although obviously we know that people who identify as Black, Indigenous, and people of color have been living with the impact of racism for hundreds and hundreds of years, it's been really clear, and as we've been bringing the conversation to the forefront over the past 4 years, and I think over the past year especially, so even though there's a long, long, long history, I think what we've actually been able to over the past year is have more substantive conversations, talk about anti-racism, talk about anti-Black racism in settings like this one, where honestly, I don't know that we could have done that a few years ago. And so although I am so excited and so thrilled to have a vice president who's a woman who identifies as Black and South Asian, I think unfortunately one of the lessons that I've taken away from the last election is that we still have a lot of people who just doubled down on their commitment to white supremacy. The majority of white Americans in this country voted to keep Donald Trump in office. And if you were not aware of that, I think that's worth repeating, that the majority of white people in this country voted to keep Donald Trump in office. And so what do? We need to keep fighting. We need to keep talking. And we've got to keep the conversation that we've been really leaning into around racism and racial justice on the front burner. I think we have to explicitly continue to recognize and name structural racism, recognize and name anti-Black racism, and look at how these affect our patients in our community. In medical education, we need to continue to recognize and teach race as a social construct and not as a biological construct. And then I think we need to continually keep challenging ourselves. How are white and white adjacent identifying groups complicit in upholding some of these systems and structures of oppression? And so we just need to remember that we cannot let ourselves off the hook for these conversations because of the outcome of this election. I think similar to after President Obama was elected, there was this wave of people being like, oh, we're post-racial, right? And I am worried that we may have the same sort of thing in the wake of Kamala Harris being elected as vice president. But I think we have to continue to keep our eyes on the prize and recognize that structural racism is alive and well in this country, and we have to do what we can do to dismantle. So that leads into my second big lesson learned. And this is actually a lesson learned over the past year that I think all of us probably have learned this together. And that lesson is that we can do big things together. We can make structural change together. And so I think as it comes specifically to thinking about anti-racism, we have to keep this on the front burner. We have to keep talking about it, and we need to act, right? So it's not enough to just keep the conversation going. We actually need to do something. And I think as we think about what our actions are, we have to avoid the temptation of just picking the low-hanging fruit, right? Just starting another training is not enough. We actually have to look at who's in leadership, how are our structures working, who's getting funding, who's getting resources, and those are the things that we need to lean into. A bunch of us on this call collaborated, and many of you who are listening also helped to work on an anti-racism task force report that we submitted to Dr. Hirsch a few weeks ago. There are some great actionable items in there that I think we just need to continue to move forward. The 2 things that I'm really thinking are at the forefront of my mind. One are how do we really make a commitment to actively hiring diverse faculty and diversifying our leadership. And what that means is that people who are in positions of leadership and power need to really think about shifting resources and power. And as one of the APs for the residency program, I also take that very seriously myself. And then for those of you who know me, know that I've been talking a lot about the idea that we need to change medical education. We need a new type of physician, a type of physician who's able to understand systems change and structures of oppression. And then we need to train physicians to be able to dismantle these things. And so that means that it needs to be part of medical education, that we're talking about systems thinking, about structural competency. We need to invest in patient-centered systems. And I love that Dr. Ross talked about restorative justice. I think we need to think about what restorative practices do we need to implement within medicine and within medical education that actually name racism and take responsibility for the harm that our systems are doing. And then I'm so very much committed to working on our culture of inclusion. I think medical education has always been centered around our white learners, and I wonder what would it look like to center our Black, Indigenous, and people of color learners in medical education. I don't think we've looked at medical education in that frame before, but I think that would be a transformative thing for us to be able to do that. So I'll stop there and hand it back to you, Felicie. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your powerful words, Jyoti. So we'll take one more panelist to answer this question, just because we want to make sure to open it up to all of our participants to be able to share their reflections and questions as well with our panelists to continue this discussion. So for Ami, can you please provide some of your ideas on kind of what are these next steps that we take and lessons?
All right, thank you. You know, for those of you that are C-SPAN junkies and have ever watched people speaking on the floor of the House of Representatives, when the person before you says something really profound, what you want to say is, I want to associate myself with the remarks from the previous speaker. So absolutely, I think everything that Jyoti said, 100%. Let me just amplify that. I could not agree more, and I appreciate how eloquently you put that out there, much better than I could. Let me reemphasize the big one. Elections matter. Elections matter. When people turn out to vote, we can change leadership and vastly redirect the policy priorities of this government. And if we have learned one thing from this past election, it is that. UCSF has a role to play in making sure that people vote. My office, Community and Government Relations, had a very active Get Out the Vote campaign called UCSF Votes. We worked with student associations, alumni associations, faculty groups. We worked with the medical center to find ways to ethically and responsibly, even in the hospitals with patients, you know, wearing buttons, vote, voter registration form. We were really active in trying to turn out the vote at UCSF. University of California can't legally advocate in elections. We can't tell people who to vote for or not vote for, but we can tell people to vote. And I think we really tried to do our part with that. And the same with the census. UCSF is really active about trying to turn out folks to respond to their census forms. We had recruitment booths on campus for folks to sign up to be census workers. So another important way of making sure that, you know, everybody, California and our most vulnerable populations respond to the census so that we can get the federal funding that we need to serve those communities. So while we can't advocate as a UC, we can't support candidates. We can endorse ballot measures, which we did with Prop 14 and Prop 16. And while we can't advocate, even after we endorse, we still can't advocate. You see, this was confusing. UCSF, like, we couldn't spend public money to say, everybody go vote for Prop 16. That's actually not legal, but we can educate. And we did several ballot initiative forums in partnership with the League of Women Voters to educate people so that they would understand, for example, this is what Prop 16 does. It allows use of race as a factor in determining admission to UC, employment, and contracting. It does not set quotas, things like that. So we can do more of that education that was mentioned earlier, you know, that was a reason, lack of that, people misunderstood Prop 16 and didn't vote for it. UCSF, we can take action on policy, and we do. Speaker Nancy Pelosi, thank you, came to UCSF a couple years ago and said, we need scientists and doctors to come out of the labs and off the wards and talk about what good science means, because when it comes to climate change, reproductive health access, issues like that, hearing from doctors, those are the most important voices. And if COVID-19 has taught us one thing, it's that. So let me wrap up by saying that I encourage folks to reach out to me if you identify through your state associations or national associations policy issues where you think UC should be active. My job is to help figure out how to either get UC engaged or help you engage personally. I can also come out and speak to your faculty or staff organizations. I've come out to speak to the PLUS program, for example, about how to do advocacy, and I have a whole presentation on that I would love to provide to anyone who would like to learn more. Thank you very much for the invitation today.
Thank you so much, Ami. We really appreciate you, sharing this wonderful information and your thoughts. So we have another question to pose to our panelists from our participants who are out there joining us. So with this participant, they were sharing that, social media really seemed to play a big role within this election, and that it seems that there's increasing evidence of social media's role in spreading misinformation, exacerbating division, and worsening mental health among youth. So for whichever panelists would like to answer this, can you please comment on the impacts of social media on health?
Dr. Rulerich.
I would love to speak on that. Social media is very huge in how it not only impacts health, but also impacts education, as you just alluded to, how it impacts what people vote for. And I'm just alluding back to what we said previously is we really need to look at social media platforms that are utilized heavily by different communities. We talked about like how Wechat is very heavily utilized by the Chinese population within our state and also nationally. That's not Instagram, that's not Twitter. That's something that many people may not have known about prior, but that is a mechanism with which a lot of people from a specific community do get their news, and that did impact how they did choose to vote for affirmative action. Also, it has impacted how they have seen other issues prior with regards to police brutality and things of that nature. So we really do need to think about like how it is. I think it speaks to a larger issue is how it is our different communities and our different generations really do get their news. Because a lot of people in my generation, the millennial generation, we do get our news from social media. And that's where a lot of different conversations tend to happen on Instagram Live and things of that nature. And some data since the last election has come out, as you also mentioned about like truly how candidates can utilize that. And unfortunately, I think, again, it's something that conservatives know how to really, really use very particularly well, that a lot of more progressive candidates and organizations are just now starting to tap into.
Anyone else want to comment?
I can comment a little bit on that. And I think this is a little bit to the previous question and kind of ties into this question. And I think one of the major things that we learned and that was very evident through social media is that science and medicine is not immune from politics. Particularly this past year, medicine was very much politicized. And as a community, we were very much attacked. And in social media, a lot of misinformation. Social media was definitely the tool to pass misinformation onto the public, as well as to take trust away from the medical community, particularly during this pandemic. So I think that's really, really important for us to understand and be more critical about. And we saw an evolution, whether it was the AAP, the California Medical Association, and even more so than ever, the American Medical Association, and several journals really engaging a lot more in the dialogue around misinformation and around things like systemic racism and discrimination and how that affects us how it affects children and communities in general. So, I mean, social media has been a very powerful tool. And I think that we saw that as a medical community, we saw the way in which opinions and misinformation can quickly spread.
I'd like to just comment very quickly because I'm coming out of clinic and had a literally had a situation where I encountered this like head on an hour ago. So I had a new baby, 7-week-old, and his 7-year-old sister. And so we were talking about, you know, we're going to do his first set of shots. And so I said, you know, he can't get his flu shot, so his sister should for sure get hers. And then both mom and dad said, we don't want to do the flu shot because we've heard a lot of bad things about it. And so, you know, I'm like, you must have heard it from Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, wherever. So I said, oh, really? Who do you know who's had a bad experience from the flu shot? And they said, nobody. And I said, well, where did you get that from? We've just seen it on different things. And I'm like, oh, okay. So I faced it head on, and I was just like, tell me who you know. And if you don't know anybody, let me tell you what I know, which is I get my flu shot every year. I give my flu shot to my baby every year. And I wouldn't do something to your child that I wouldn't do for myself or my family. And I do it because I want to be healthy. And so, you know, I list all my facts, but I just feel like the only way that I have, the only tool that I have to combat the misinformation and the fake news is to be real and to tell them this is real life. And I'm not going to base my decisions on my health or my family's health on stuff that I know is not true. So that's one thing I wanted to say. And then the other thing I wanted to say is Georgia. So this doesn't directly speak to the fake news and the social media question, but the question before that is, Georgia showed me that Black women, number one, are the bomb, let's just say that, and the power of organizing. So Stacey Abrams, Latasha Scott, like the work that they put in over years, but the way that it transpired and the way that it showed itself shows me that anything is possible. And if Georgia can flip, then any state can flip. So I think that was also a significant thing that came from this election.
I could add something about social media as well. One of the things that has made the newspaper recently is about how social media spreads so much disinformation about COVID. A recent story that just blew me away this week was nurses in South Dakota, just having a gigantic spike, one of the biggest in the country, report that even as patients are dying of COVID-19, they don't believe that it's real. They believe it must be something else. And they literally have it themselves in the hospital and they're dying of it and don't believe that they have it. And it's something that you can attribute to politics and the president and anything else, but social media certainly amplifies that. I would encourage folks to watch a Netflix documentary about this very concept. Some of you may have seen it. It's called The Social Dilemma, and it describes how the algorithm works to direct content at you that it thinks that you will like based on what you've put before. Not based on what's true, because there is no algorithm to detect truth. But the artificial intelligence directs you towards things that it thinks you will like, with the goal of not helping you or improving your life, but getting you to buy whatever is being advertised, because we are the product. So highly recommend that because of the serious complications and consequences for our patients and for public health.
Thank you for that. I think we just have 2 minutes, and there's a question from Efrat about the that Dr. Walsh, you noted the disappointment in the state of California and the proposition results. Many of us agree. What do you think this says about the state of California? And then Raul, I know you want to share a little bit about a resource. Anyone want to address the, what does this say about California?
I can say quickly. I think we definitely, it just says that we as Californians, we can't hold ourselves as separate from the rest of the nation. We are very much and have always been a part of the rest of the nation. So if the nation's white supremacist, it is here in California as well. And we see that not just, I mean, we need to think about like, yes, we did get our first African-American, first Asian-American woman as vice president, but the vice president out of California before that was Richard Nixon. And we know who that is. So we really have to, like, we can't put ourselves off the hook, I think, in California as being on the cutting edge of progressivism, because when we think about being progressive, we have to think about what are we progressing towards. And I have to question that progress after this election.
Thank you.
I'd also just like to throw out there that there were a fair, more than I'm comfortable with even admitting, amount of Black and brown people that voted for Donald Trump. So I think it also just that speaks to the misinformation, you know, a pandemic that we're facing. But I think as diverse of a state as we are, number one, like Dr. Woolridge mentioned, there's a fair amount of white supremacy in California. I think it's number 3 on the list of all states for the most hate groups. But then also that, you know, Black and brown votes aren't automatic Democratic votes. And I think part of that is because we don't know our power and we don't realize what we're voting for sometimes. There's not great education, so work to be done.
So it's 1 o'clock, and I think that work to be done is a beautiful way to end this conversation. I think there's a lot more to say about everything, but I think this was a real good way of sharing what all people would like to know about, and that's what can we do and what is being done within our department. And I'm in awe of all the fantastic work that all of you do. I think there's some links on the chat that we see if we can share when we send out the link to the video of this. Anda and Felicie, any closing remarks before I hand it over to Dr. Hirsch?
I just want to say thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists. You've definitely provided a lot of food for thought and helping us to really think about the direction that we're moving, you know, to keep supporting our children's families, communities of color, just everyone. So thank you so much for your time.
Dr. Hirsch, you want to close?
Okay, well, I want to thank the panelists as well as the audience for a really amazing grand rounds. Absolutely a very essential topic and a conversation that is going to continue for quite some time, I'm sure. We'll come back to this topic at some point for an update. I think I'll leave that up to Sandrain as to when. But thanks, everybody. Appreciate all you're doing and be well. Happy Thanksgiving to everybody. The CDC just made a recommendation not to travel, so everybody will make their choices about how to respond to that. But I wish everybody and their families a happy Thanksgiving. Bye-bye.
Thank you.